going to be spread out evenly among the entire population because theoretically everybody needs to eat roughly the same amount of food to live. However, you're now going to have to pay the taxes that you wouldn't have had to pay had we had income tax. I don't like taxes. Nobody likes taxes. But I do like roads and schools and things like that that come from it. And, this is definitely a economic decision. Whether it's a good decision or not, I will leave up to you. But I don't want anybody to walk into the election, if you're in my class, not understanding that this doesn't mean the state is getting rid of taxes and you're not going to have to pay them. That you're just going to be paying them a different way. Does that make sense? Is anybody confused about that? Anybody want to argue with me? I love it when people argue with me. I'm not kidding. There's a lot of people who think this is a really good idea. You will have more money on your paycheck.
And then more will come out.
Well, yeah, I mean, no more will come out from your paycheck, but
the tax
will just be transitioning from the point where you get paid to the point where you spend. And we didn't even talk about property taxes, and that's what you were kind of getting at a few minutes ago. Nobody has proposed getting rid of property taxes yet in the state of Missouri. That is typically something wealthy individuals like seeing happen, because if you own a multi-million-dollar piece of land, you're going to pay more taxes on that property than if you own a, studio condo.
Well, it's just like those millionaires where they have property in New York and it's some huge, loft apartment that's worth millions of dollars and they don't even live there.
Mm-hmm.
It just sits there vacant, and then they don't have to pay tax money for it as much as the general population does just to simply live and work and eat. And then it screws over everyone who's poor or part of a minority, while these people sit on the top and don't suffer at all.
There's a really interesting thing going on in New York right now, and that's probably a class in and of itself. But they're proposing progressive taxes on subsequent homes. So if you have your primary residence, it would be one tax rate, but if you have a second residence in New York, it would be astronomically higher. It should be that way.
Well, people are so close together there that the rent's so high even just to live anywhere.
Yeah.
It'd be different if you have two properties and you live out in the middle of nowhere. But people are closed in. It's hard to even afford a basic apartment. The homelessness, that stuff's a real issue there. And then you have these millionaires with these huge apartments that they don't even live in.
Yep.
It's just...
So the government typically has several, we're going to list 6 primary economic goals. The first is growth, where the economy produces more goods, services, and opportunities than it did before. This would be the change in what we're producing. So basically, the way we would measure this is if in 2024 we produced 1 billion widgets, we would like to see in 2025 that we produce more than 1 billion widgets. Widget is a technical term in law. I'm kidding, that's a joke. But a widget is pretty much anything. It's just, we don't want to pick a product like scarves or balls or something, so we just use the term widget. 2, low unemployment. They want people to work. People who want to work can find work, more or less. It's one of the problems with our economy right now. People who want to work are increasingly finding it difficult to find work. 3, price stability. Inflation does not rise so fast that people's income loses value. Inflation is where basically the price of goods and services increase, so the value of the dollar decreases. And we've seen a lot of this over the last couple of years. If you go to the grocery store and you want to buy some sort of staple that we've bought for generations, like a gallon of milk, that costs you more today than it did last year this time. The rate of inflation is the rate that those prices are going up. The prices always go up in a somewhat healthy economy, but the government wants to try and keep that rate low. What's a low rate? Any positive rate below about 2 to 3%. So roughly, goods and services should go up by 1 to 2% per year. But during COVID, for example, we saw a 2-year period where the rate of inflation over those 2 years was 20%. Inflation is crazy high at the moment. My economic predictor is a case of Diet Coke at Sam's, because that is my addiction. And before the pandemic, it was $10 for a 35 pack of Diet Coke. That jumped up to about $18, $19 during the pandemic. It fell back down to about $15 afterwards. It's back up to over $20 for a case of Diet Coke. And there's lots of things that play into that. With that rate of inflation, how much your money, or how far your money goes, is going to be one of the things the government wants to keep low. There are things out there like the Consumer Price Index that will basically tell you what the relative price of a dollar, or what the relative value of a dollar is. 4, economic security. People are protected from major shocks like job loss, poverty, illness, or old age. That's the whole point of the social security system. Increasingly, that's not well funded, so that's a little bit of an issue. 5, opportunity and fairness. The benefits of the economy are distributed in a way people view as unacceptable. How many people think that you have as good of a shot as somebody who has 10 times your wealth? Or to put it more bluntly, I think the top 10 richest people in the United States have more wealth than the rest of the United States population combined. If we look at it like an asset sheet, Jeff Bezos, for example, has a higher net worth than the entire United States does. Admittedly, that's because the United States is in trillions of dollars of debt. And Jeff Bezos, while he probably has debt, does not have as much debt as the United States. But still, when you have people who can control the majority of the wealth over other people, that's when we have things happen like the French Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. 6, fiscal responsibility. Government wants to avoid unsustainable deficits or debt. Every presidential election, you'll hear people talk about their plan for eliminating the national debt. So far, in my lifetime, I have not seen any progress made towards that goal. Lots of times these goals can conflict. So, for example, if we stimulate the economy, we can risk inflation. How do we stimulate the economy? Well, the Federal Reserve Bank, for example, can lower interest rates to near zero. The Federal Reserve Bank's interest rate, when we're talking about this, is the interest that a bank will pay on a loan they get from the Federal Reserve. So Chase can walk in and say, I'd like $1 billion. And the government, if the interest rates are at zero, will say, okay, and hand them the cash. When they're ready to repay it, they repay it. Is there a interest collected on this? No. Right now, I think the interest rate is sitting around something like 4%. If you get a mortgage, you will typically pay slightly above whatever that interest rate is. If the interest rate is 4%, the best you can hope for on a mortgage is 5 or 6%. This is important because it makes it easier or harder for us as consumers to access goods and services on credit. So I might have to swap batteries here in a second because I'm down to 14%. stimulating the economy. All right, next we can cut spending in ways to reduce the deficit, but this typically hurts people who rely on programs. If we cut Medicaid, for example, then the people who are relying on that for their income or their insurance are no longer going to be able to get income or insurance. Lower taxes may encourage investment, but they reduce public revenue. If we get rid of, for example, Missouri got rid of the capital gains tax. Capital gains are when you sell something like a stock and you get income from that. How many of you guys are selling stocks? Nope. In Missouri, if you were to sell a stock before, you would pay a certain percentage of that to the state. No longer. So this is a great tax break for people who can afford to buy and sell stocks. However, because of this, the state has lost a lot more money than they thought they would. I know a big discussion in education right now is how are we going to fund the universities? Because there is a like $50 million deficit between what the projected revenue would be and what the state is actually making. Finally, regulations may protect workers or consumers, but increase cost for businesses. Missouri, I think 2 years ago, by a referendum, enacted a law that guaranteed people paid sick leave. Do you know how many guaranteed paid sick leave days Missouri had to guarantee a full-time employee? Anyone? 2. If you worked 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, you were guaranteed to have 2 paid sick days. However, businesses didn't like this. They said it was costing them money, and the Missouri legislature repealed that. And so now there is no longer any guaranteed sick leave. Most economic policy fights are not between good and bad goals. They're between good goals that conflict. It's not bad to give people sick leave. Simultaneously, it's not bad to have companies that want to make money. Both of these are good things, but that conflict is kind of where economic policy lives. We talked about a lot of this, but we'll go through some of it already real quick. Fiscal policy means government decisions about taxing and spending. Spending as an economic policy does things like creating jobs, funding infrastructure, supporting education, providing benefits, stabilizing people during downturns, and increase demand in the economy. Taxes, as an economic policy, however, taxes can raise revenue, encourage or discourage behavior, redistribute resources, and affect investment and consumption. Florida, for example, wants to discourage people from being like OnlyFans influencers, so they have proposed a what some people are calling a sin tax, but basically taxing revenue that is earned through things like OnlyFans at a higher rate. That would be that encourage or discourage behavior. Similarly, we're encouraged to have children. If you have kids, you get a massive tax reduction. All right, deficit and debt. A deficit is where the government spends more than it takes in during a period, and a debt is the accumulated borrowing over time. Fiscal policy is powerful but politically difficult because it forces choices about taxes, spending, and priorities. A budget is an economic policy document. It tells us what government is willing to fund, who it is willing to tax, and what it is willing to borrow. We talked a little bit about the Federal Reserve Bank, but I want to define the term monetary policy. This involves efforts to influence the economy through money, credit, and interest rates. This is mainly associated with the Federal Reserve, not Congress directly. The Federal Reserve has traditionally been apolitical. They've been, they've stood outside of that government bubble to some extent so that they can make decisions based on what they want, not based on what politicians want. We've seen challenges to this where Donald Trump is trying to get rid of Jerome Powell. His term expires in like a month anyway. So I don't know what all the drama's about, but basically the president would like the Federal Reserve Bank to follow his will more than what they're doing at the moment. Just real quick so you guys understand this, when interest rates go up, borrowing becomes more expensive, spending and investments may slow, inflation may cool off, but growth and hiring can weaken. On the other hand, when interest rates go down, borrowing becomes much cheaper, spending and investments may rise, growth may improve, but inflation can become a risk. Monetary policy is less visible to ordinary voters than taxes or spending, but it has a huge effect on everyday life. Regulation and economic rules. I'm going to pause here really quick and swap out batteries, and then I will resume. So 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. We're back. Talked about monetary policy. So economic policy also includes the rules the government set for markets. For example, we have workplace safety rules here. You can't make somebody work in a 400-degree place for too long. We have environmental rules, like you can't drop toxic sludge into a river. There's banking rules. What happens if you go and deposit $20,000 to the bank? Well, they're going to need to prove who you are, where you got the money from, and stuff like that, because there are different rules the government has to try and prevent things like money laundering. There's consumer protection. In Missouri, if somebody makes a material representation before, during, or after the sale of goods or services, they are subject to criminal prosecution and civil penalties. What does this mean? Hey, come on into this salon. I guarantee that these nails are going to last for a month, and they fall off in 2 days, and they knew they would fall off in 2 days. That's material misrepresentation. You go in and you say, I'd like you to fix this, and they say, ha ha ha, all sales are final. You can probably sue them under the Merchandising Practices Act. Antitrust and competition policies. Does anybody know what Monopoly is, besides a board game which you either love or despise with all your being?
Isn't it where, like, a company has, like, a ridiculous amount of power because it owns a bunch of other companies and is able to, like, buy them out?
That's exactly right. If you, for example, have a phone, does your phone, what operating system does your phone run?
iOS.
It's probably either iOS or Android. Well, because Apple owns iOS and Android owns Android, you have only these two choices. They can kind of set the prices that you're going to pay for things. How much does a subscription, or what are the fees that Apple collects on apps and services? It's like 30%. It's crazy high. There's nowhere else you can go to get those services because Apple has a slight monopoly there. Granted, they created it and everything, but the whole idea is that if you have more business actors in a given arena, then you're going to have a better outcome for the consumer because people will fight to try and deliver the best service at the lowest cost. But if we allow certain conglomerates to get together, then they can kind of fix the market to help them. There's an interesting YouTube video. I'll try and post it if I can find it. But does everybody know there used to be light bulbs that would last forever, like tungsten filament light bulbs that wouldn't die. And a bunch of the companies that produced light bulbs got together and formed a cartel basically and said, hey, we are going to make it so that light bulbs only last this long. If you make non-conforming light bulbs, you've got to pay us a big fine. What happens if a light bulb lasts forever? People stop buying light bulbs because they don't need them. And so they got together and planned the obsolescence of these light bulbs so that these companies could continue making money. These are the things that are what we call antitrust, because they basically make it so that you can't be successful as a consumer. You're just subject to the whims of the companies. Minimum wage rules. Minimum wage hasn't gone up in a very, very, very long time. I think where we're at right now, minimum wage is basically equivalent to something like $30,000 a year, I think. The poverty standard is like to qualify for food stamps, I think we're sitting at about 36,000 a year or below. But interestingly enough, there has been some studies that say that if you actually want to make a living wage in today's economy, you need to make about 150,000 a year as a couple, like as a family. The minimum wage, as calculated back in the day when it was created, was the amount of money required to live in a house and provide the very bare minimum goods and services for you and your family. So how much money does it cost for you to eat, and how much money does it cost for you to have somewhere to sleep? It doesn't include things like the furniture or cable or anything like that. The problem is that inflation has happened so much, and the way that consumers have to buy things have changed so much that the amount of money that actually costs has not been accounted for in the way we calculate minimum wage. And then finally, labor protections. Things like saying, okay, because people should be able to do something other than just work all their lives, we're going to have overtime. It's mandatory overtime if you work more than 40 hours in a week in most situations. Unless you're salaried, then you're an exempt employee. Fun times. Why do we do this? Well, we want to make sure that we have a workforce that's capable of working. There's lots of trade-offs. Regulations can protect consumers, workers, and the public, reduce harms, and create predictability. But on the flip side, typically when we regulate things, it's going to increase the cost, reduce flexibility, create compliance burdens, and trigger political conflict. Markets do not exist outside rules. Economic policy is often a fight over what the rules should be. And we are going to skip this structured activity in favor of the time. And we'll just kind of wrap up there unless anybody has any questions. Hearing none,